Hi, welcome back. We are on chapter 14 of So Be It by Sarah Weeks. This one's called Pretty. It looked different from the photographs. Older. The shutters had been removed and the whole place was painted dark green instead of white. Only the sign was the same. Hilltop Home, Liberty, New York. "Here we are," said the driver, stopping at the bottom of the long dirt driveway. "You're sure it's still open?" "I'm sure," I said. "See, there are lights on up there." "Oh, yeah, I see. Well, I brung a fare up here once years ago, and I think I remember there's no good place to turn around up top. So since it ain't raining no more, you mind walking up?" I said I didn't mind, thanked him, and got out. "That was some lucky guess you made back there, kid," the driver said just before he pulled away. "Man, oh man, what I'd give for a little of that kind of luck on bingo night." I stood there looking up at the place I'd traveled all this way to get to, and it looked back down at me with half-shut window eyes and a porch mouth full of railing teeth. Listen to the eyes, Heidi. But I couldn't tell anything from Hilltop's face. Even though it wasn't that far away from downtown Liberty, only about 15 minutes or so, the storm had either skipped over the area or not reached it yet. The sky was an ominous dark gray, but the ground was still dry. As I started slowly up the steep driveway, a sudden gust of wind blew through and caught in the shaggy boughs of an old hemlock tree. "Soof," they whispered softly as they swayed overhead. This time I didn't cover my ears. I was glad to hear Mama's word there, reminding me one more time why I had come. My shoes kicked up little clouds of fine brown dust as I quickened my pace and hurried up the driveway. Up the wide porch steps, past a couple of pots of flowers and a pair of white-painted rocking chairs with wicker seats. The square panes of glass in the front door were covered by a lace curtain inside. I knocked, but nobody answered. Setting my suitcase and the jar of jelly beans down on the porch, I knocked again. And when nobody came, I turned the knob and walked in. It smelled old and musty, like Bernadette's medicine cabinet when you first slid it open. There wasn't much furniture in the front room, just a vinyl couch with big round buttons on the cushions and a couple of matching armchairs. "Hello?" I called out, and after a minute again, "Hello?" No answer. So I went down the hall toward the sound of the voices. I passed a large kitchen on my left with big metal pots hanging from a rack over a long counter, and on the right a bathroom with white and black checkered floor tiles. Then came a small room set up like an office, with a phone and a typewriter on the desk. The voices were coming from behind a tall wooden door at the end of the hall, and as I got closer, I was able to make out bits and pieces of what was being said inside. There was music playing, either a record or someone strumming a guitar. "David, do you want to be the cheese?" I heard a woman's voice ask. At least that's what it sounded like, she'd said. I felt uncomfortable standing out in the hall like that, eavesdropping. "Hello?" I called again, hoping maybe the woman inside would hear me, but the door was heavy, and too much was going on behind it for anyone to hear me calling. I glanced to my right, into the little office with the typewriter and the phone. I hadn't noticed it at first, but there was a big gray filing cabinet in there too, stuffed so full of manila folders the drawers couldn't possibly have shut. So many folders, hundreds, each one tagged with a small blue label across the top that looked like it could have a name written on it. "Get whatever answers there are to be gotten, Heidi." I wish I could say I had trouble deciding what to do next, but I didn't. I knew it was wrong, but the thought that one of those folders might contain the very truth I'd come so far to find made it easy. Once I'd stepped inside and closed the door behind me, I found that the room was in fact considerably larger than I had originally imagined. There was a separate alcove off the little office with a patterned rug on the floor, several plants in heavy clay pots, and a red armchair that sat with its high back toward me in front of a nice big window overlooking a wooded hill. Our apartment in Reno didn't get much light, so things had a hard time growing there. We tried keeping plants, ivy and jade, and even an avocado we sprouted from a pit stuck around with toothpicks and hung over a jar of water. But eventually, everything always died. So instead, Bernie ordered silk plants and flowers from one of her catalogs and set them up on rows on the windowsills to brighten things up. Sometimes she even sprayed cologne on them. "Wouldn't fool a bee, but it does the trick for me," she'd say, as she spritzed them with the old atomizer with the faded pink squeeze ball that belonged to her grandmother. The plants in the alcove at Hilltop were so perfect. I wondered if they could possibly be real, especially the one that sat right next to the red armchair. It had long, slender, pointed dark green leaves, and off the tips of those leaves dangled strands of the prettiest flowers. So delicate and white, I just had to know for sure. I crossed the carpet and was just about to touch one of the flowers to rub the petals between my thumb and forefinger when suddenly I gasped and had to clap my hand over my mouth to keep from crying out. I was not alone. There was a man sitting in the chair. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bother you. I didn't think," I stammered. "There was nobody out front when I came in, so I—" His face was turned away from me, and it took me a minute to realize that the reason he wasn't responding was that he was sound asleep. I heard the slow, even sound of his breathing as his chest rose and fell. I could have turned and left then, or taken a chance and done what I'd planned to do in the first place, go through the files looking for Mama. Instead, I tiptoed around to the other side of the chair in order to see his face. His neck was bent to the side, his chin and cheek pressed down against one shoulder, like a bird trying to tuck its head under a wing to sleep. His dark hair was mowed short, not much more than prickles across his scalp, and his skin was smooth and so pale I could see blue veins pulsing in his forehead. Suddenly he shifted and stirred in his sleep, and then his head snapped up and back, and he opened his eyes and looked straight at me. At first his look was blank, his jaw hanging loose, his right cheek streaked with a red imprint from the chair's upholstery. And then all of a sudden, his face lit up with recognition, and he broke into a wide, toothy grin. "Soof," he said in a strange, soft, guttural voice. "Soof." Chapter 15, called Now. "Elliot, you awake, Ellie?" a woman called from out in the hall, the same voice I'd heard earlier coming from behind the big heavy door. Now she was turning the handle and coming into the room, heels clicking, crisp white pants swishing. When she saw me, she stopped short and stood with one hand on her hip, looking at me, puzzled. "Can I help you?" she said. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was staring at the man in the red chair who knew Mama's word. There was something oddly familiar about him. "Who are you?" the woman asked. Elliot answered for me. "Soof," he said, taking hold of my hand and looking over at her with the same wide grin he'd given me before. Mama had said Soof when she'd seen the photograph I'd torn in half, and I had wondered if Soof was the woman in the red sweater, or maybe Mama herself. Then Georgia had made me wonder if it could be my father. Now Elliot's touch unfroze my voice just enough so I could ask a question I hadn't thought to ask before. "Am I Soof?" I whispered. Elliot smiled at me again, and the woman laughed. "Ah, I certainly hope so. He says that word at least 100 times a day. I'd like nothing better than to know who or what the heck he's been talking about all this time. Not even Mr. Hill seems to know," she said. "Or if he does, he won't say." "Thurman Hill?" I asked. She nodded. "Elliot's father," she explained. "But am I Soof?" I asked again. "You tell me," she laughed. "Ruby," I heard a man's voice calling from out in the hall. "In here, Mr. Hill," she called back over her shoulder. When Thurman Hill, tall and thin with a full head of thick white hair, walked into the room, I felt exactly the way I'd felt looking up at Hilltop home for the first time from the bottom of the driveway. His face was impossible to read, especially his eyes, which were a shade of blue I'd seen only one other place before, in the cloudy chunk of sea glass Bernie always kept in her jewelry box. "Who are you?" he asked in a voice that sounded like it too might have been tossed about and polished smooth by a million grains of sand. "My name is Heidi It," I said, trying hard to keep my voice from shaking. "And I have some questions I need to ask you, Mr. Hill." "Oh, are you a reporter for your school newspaper or something?" asked the woman he'd called Ruby. "Mr. Hill isn't much for that sort of thing, but I'd be glad to let you interview me if you'd like, though I'm boring as bread." "I'm not from the newspaper. I just want to know if my mother used to live here," I said. Something changed in Thurman Hill's face. "What did you say your name was?" he asked. He bent down to get a closer look at me, and I noticed the gold watch he was wearing. The thin white hands on the blue oval face said that it was 4 o'clock. It had been an hour since I'd spoken to Bernie. "Heidi It," I said. "It? That's your last name? I-T?" he asked. I nodded. "And that's your mother's last name too? It?" Again I nodded. "There's never been anyone here by that name," he said, standing up straight again. "It's rather unusual. I'm sure I would remember." "Well, maybe somebody else remembers," I said. "Not very likely. This is a home for the mentally disabled. Did you know that?" he asked, not unkindly. "My mother is mentally disabled," I said. "Well, that may be, but I'm afraid she wasn't here," he said. "I know everyone who's ever been here at Hilltop." "He would. He's the big cheese," said Ruby with a wink. "Cheese stands alone," said Elliot suddenly. "Cheese stands alone." Ruby laughed. "That's right, Elliot. The cheese stands alone. Good for you." Then she turned to me to explain. "It's from The Farmer in the Dell. They all seem to love it for some reason. You know the song. The farmer takes a wife, and the wife takes a child, and all the rest, until in the end the cheese stands alone." "What makes you think your mother was at Hilltop?" Thurman Hill asked me. "Did she tell you that?" "No, but I've got photos," I said, reaching for my backpack. "Wait a second. Something's ringing bells here. Are you by any chance related to somebody named Bernadette?" asked Ruby. "Yes," I said. "She's my neighbor." "Well, that's the woman who's been calling from Nevada, Mr. Hill. Remember, I told you about her, and you said I should—" Now there was a definite change in Thurman Hill's face, though it would have been hard to say exactly what. "Never mind what I said, Ruby. Is this Bernadette person with you?" he asked me, and I noticed 2 small red blotches had begun to form on his cheeks, just below his sharp cheekbones. "She couldn't come," I said. "So you're telling me you came here by yourself?" he asked. "From Nevada?" The sea glass eyes were sharper now and colder, and they bored into me as he waited for my answer. I swallowed hard and nodded. "Did you run away?" he asked. "No," I said. "Shall I look up her mother in the file, Mr. Hill?" Ruby asked. He ignored her, still staring at me intently, as if I were some sort of puzzle he was trying to work out. "May I see these photographs you say you have?" he asked quietly. I opened my backpack and pulled out the photos, handing the stack out to him. When he reached for them, his fingers brushed against mine, and his skin was so cold I jerked my hand away, scattering into the photographs all over the floor. Ruby quickly bent and began to pick them up. "Hey, look at this," she said, holding one of the photos out to Mr. Hill. "It's the one of people standing out on the porch under the Hilltop sign. That's our sign, isn't it?" "Where did you get these?" he asked, and I saw that the blotches on his cheeks were spreading like 2 bright red stains. "I found the film in an old camera in the drawer," I said. "We think the pictures were taken about 13 years ago, because Bernadette says maybe Mama was pregnant with me in the pictures, and I'm 12 now." I'm going to stop there, and then we will finish this chapter in the next episode.